In a small jail cell in North Carolina, a prisoner is quietly covering the walls with writing. The local people gather to stare because not one of them can read a single mark. The script is beautiful and flowing, and utterly foreign to the slaveholders of the American South. It is Arabic, and the words he is writing are verses from the Holy Quran. He learned those verses as a boy, in a school of mud and sunlight, half a world away. Now they are the only piece of home that no one here is able to take from him. The year is around 1810, and this man is a runaway, classed as another man's property. But he is also a scholar who studied his faith for 25 years across the sea. I am Brother Idris, and I want to take a sledgehammer to something you were taught. You have very likely been told that Islam is new to America, a recent and foreign arrival. That story is comforting to some and convenient to others, and it is simply not true. Muslims were praying toward Mecca on this very soil long before there was a United States. They did not come as tourists or as immigrants chasing a dream of a better life. The first of them came in chains at the very founding of this country, against their will. This is the story of those forgotten believers, and of one man who wrote his own. So walk with me back to the beginning, before the founding fathers, before the flag. The truth we are about to uncover was deliberately buried, and it deserves to be dug back up. It is not a foreign story bolted onto America. It is an American story, from the very first page. Let us start with a simple question of dates that almost no one ever stops to ask. When did the first Muslim set foot on the land that would one day become America? Most people today would guess it happened sometime in the last 100 years or so. The real answer reaches back nearly 5 centuries, into the age of the conquistadors. In the 1520s, a Spanish expedition sailed to conquer and claim the coast of Florida. It was a catastrophe, and almost every man aboard it died of hunger, sickness, or war. Only 4 members of that entire doomed expedition survived the terrible years that followed. And one of those 4 survivors was an enslaved man who came from the country of Morocco. His name, before slavery renamed him, was Mustafa, a Muslim born in the town of Azemmour. The Spanish called him Estevanico, and they described him as an Arabic-speaking black man. He had been seized from a Muslim land and baptized by force into the faith of his owners. Yet his origins were never in doubt, written plainly into the records as a man of Azemmour. For 8 long years, those 4 ragged castaways walked across the heart of the continent. They crossed what is now Texas and the wider Southwest on foot, surviving as wandering healers. Mustafa often went ahead of the others, learning the languages and winning the trust of nations. He became a bridge between worlds, the first of his faith to cross this enormous land. The First Nations he met often trusted him more than they trusted the pale Spanish soldiers. A man who had himself been enslaved understood, perhaps, how to approach a frightened stranger. Later, he was sent north as a scout, searching for cities that were rumored to be made of gold. At a pueblo in what is now New Mexico, that long and astonishing journey came to its end. Mustafa the Moroccan died there, killed far from the home and the faith of his birth. But hold tightly to the date, because the date is the entire point of his story. He walked across America in the 1530s as a Muslim and against his own will. That was almost a full century before the Pilgrims ever landed at Plymouth Rock. Sit with that for a second, because it quietly rearranges the whole map in your head. The Muslim was not a latecomer to this land. He was here among its very first travelers. And Mustafa was only the faint beginning of a far larger and far darker history. Over the next few centuries, The Atlantic slave trade tore millions of Africans from their homes. By the most careful counts, around 12 million human beings were carried across that ocean. Several 100,000 of them were brought directly to the shores of North America. Each of those numbers, however large, is a person with a name, a family, and a faith. It is far too easy to let the sheer scale of the horror blur them into a faceless mass. And here is the fact that has been quietly left out of the textbooks for generations. A great many of those stolen Africans were not followers of local traditional religions alone. They were Muslims, raised in the faith, who knew their prayers and their scripture by heart. By careful estimates, tens of thousands of the people enslaved in America were Muslim believers. Some scholars argue the true number ran far higher, perhaps into the hundreds of thousands. They came in such numbers because of exactly where the slave ships did their hunting. Many captives were taken from the Muslim lands of West Africa, near the great Senegal River. That region had been Muslim for centuries, with kings, scholars, and grand mosques of mud brick. The ships did not know or care that they were carrying away an entire educated class. So Islam did not sail to America in comfort, carrying a suitcase and a printed passport. It arrived in the dark holds of slave ships, in chains, inside the hearts of the captured. A man could be stripped of his clothes, his name, and his freedom, and still keep his prayers. That stubborn, invisible kind of survival is the real subject of this entire story. And once it was here, it did something the entire system of slavery was designed to prevent. For a time, against truly impossible odds, this stolen faith stubbornly refused to die. To understand what was lost, you first have to throw away a cruel and lazy assumption. The assumption is that the Africans brought here arrived with no learning and no history. The men and women in those slave ships came from old and sophisticated civilizations. Many came from a belt of West Africa where Islam had flourished for many centuries. In the lands along the Senegal and Gambia rivers, learning and scholarship were deeply prized. There were whole towns full of Quranic schools, where children memorized scripture from a young age. There were scholars, judges, and teachers, and quiet libraries of books written in Arabic. A boy in those lands might spend 20 years studying theology, law, and the older sciences. This was the same wider world that had once built the libraries of Timbuktu and Cordoba. Knowledge was not a luxury there. It was the very center of a respectable life. So when the slavers seized these people, they were not seizing only laborers for the fields. They were seizing imams, princes, merchants, and scholars, and dragging them all into bondage. These captives could often read and write Arabic when their own masters could not read at all. Imagine the strange terror of that for a slaveholder who believed himself naturally superior. His property could read a holy book in an ancient language that he himself could not. And a few of them left behind proof of exactly who they were that still survives today. Consider a man named Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, a Muslim from a family of religious leaders. He was captured and shipped to the colony of Maryland in the 1730s. Out in the fields and the pastures, he would slip away in secret to perform his daily prayers. When a local boy mocked him and threw dirt on him as he prayed, he finally fled. Like so many others in this story, he was soon caught and thrown into a jail cell. And there, exactly as others would, he covered the walls with flowing Arabic writing. His learning astonished the colonists, who had been taught that Africans had no written word. That single prejudice, that Africa was a place without writing, was a useful and deliberate lie. Men like him were living proof against it, which is part of why their stories were buried. His remarkable story spread so far that he was eventually freed and sent home across the ocean. He was said to have written out the entire Quran from memory 3 separate times. He carried the whole of his scripture inside his head, where no slaver could ever reach it. That is the kind of education these supposedly empty captives so often quietly possessed. A famous portrait of him survives, showing a dignified man with his Quran hung around his neck. He is one of the very few in this history who escaped alive and returned home. Most were not nearly so fortunate, and the story of Abdul-Rahman is far more typical. He was a true prince, born to rule a kingdom in the green highlands of West Africa. Captured in a war and sold across the sea, he was brought to the state of Mississippi. He had commanded armies and worn fine robes, and now he answered to an overseer's whip. The slave trade did not spare the highborn. It swallowed kings and commoners exactly alike. There the prince was put to work in the cotton fields like any other enslaved man. For 40 long years he labored in bondage, a king reduced to a number in a ledger. He never stopped insisting on who he truly was, even when no one around him believed it. Royalty of the soul, it turns out, is far harder to break than royalty of the throne. By an astonishing chance, a white man he met had once been saved by Abdul-Rahman's own family. That single thread of memory eventually helped to win the old prince his freedom. His plight reached all the way to the President of the United States himself. His story became briefly famous, a real African prince found laboring in American cotton. A documentary would one day be made about him, under the fitting name Prince Among Slaves. Freed at last as an old man, he set sail to return to the Africa of his birth. But he died soon after reaching its shores, never again seeing the kingdom he had lost. On a lonely island off the coast of Georgia lived a man named Bilali Muhammad. He had come from a region of West Africa famous for its Muslim scholars and its schools. His enslaver made him the head driver, trusting him to manage the entire plantation. But Bilali was quietly managing something else as well. A community of dozens of fellow Muslims. He prayed 5 times a day. He kept the fast of Ramadan, and he held to the old law. He raised his children to pray as well, on an island just far enough to be forgotten. For a brief generation, a corner of Muslim West Africa quietly breathed off the Georgia coast. When war once threatened the island, he reportedly vowed to defend it with the men of his faith. And when he died, he left behind a small, handwritten book of Islamic law. He had carried the rules of his entire religion across the ocean inside his own memory. That fragile manuscript, written in Arabic on a Georgia plantation, survives in a library to this day. It was long mistaken for a simple diary, until scholars finally understood what it truly was. It is a copybook of sacred law, the curriculum of a faith, carried across the sea in memory. Even in the new capital of the young nation, this hidden faith could quietly be found. In Georgetown, beside the city of Washington, there lived a freed African named Yero Mamut. He had survived slavery, bought his own freedom, and become a respected property owner in the city. His neighbors knew him as a devout Muslim who would not touch pork or strong drink. A celebrated American painter sat him down and captured his face for all of history. In that portrait, an old African man gazes out with a calm and unmistakable dignity. He had outlived slavery itself, and he wore his long faith openly in the heart of the capital. Across the plantations of the South, you could find these quiet acts of faith almost everywhere. People who prayed toward the east at dawn, in a land that called their religion a sin. People who wrote verses on scraps of paper and wore them as small charms for protection. People who clung to their names, their fasts, and their God against everything built to erase them. These were not occasional eccentrics. They were a thread running quietly through the whole system. Wherever the ships from Senegambia landed, the prayers of Islam landed quietly alongside them. And one of those people would leave behind the most remarkable record of them all. His name was Omar ibn Said, and he was born around the year 1770. His home was a land called Futa Toro, set between two great rivers in West Africa. Those two rivers were the Senegal and the Gambia, the cradle of a proud Muslim people. It was a land of devout farmers and traders, governed in the name of God and His law. He came from a wealthy and respected family, but his father was killed when Omar was a child. As he grew older, Omar gave his whole life over to the patient pursuit of religious knowledge. He traveled to study under learned teachers, including his own brother, who was a respected sheikh. By his own careful account, he spent 25 years seeking the knowledge of his faith. 25 years is not the training of a simple man. It is the making of a true scholar. He would have known the Quran, the law, the grammar, and the long history of his religion. He became a scholar, a teacher, and a trader, a man of real standing in his community. He prayed, he fasted, and he gave to the poor, exactly as his religion asked of him. He was, in the language of his people, a man of the book, learned and quietly respected. His days were ordered by the call to prayer, from before dawn until the fall of night. For a Muslim of West Africa, his was a settled, comfortable, and deeply faithful life. And then, when he was already a grown man, near the age of 40, that life ended. He was not a child when slavery took him. He was a mature and accomplished man. Everything he was, everything he had built, was about to be stripped away in a single season. In his own words, a great army came into his country and killed many people. In the chaos of that war, Omar was captured and sold to the dealers in human beings. They marched him down to the coast and forced him onto what he called the Big Ship. For a full month he was carried across the big sea into a fate he could not imagine. That month in the hold of a slave ship was a horror beyond almost anything we can picture. Chained in darkness and filth, many around him would not survive the crossing at all. The ship landed at Charleston in South Carolina, one of the great markets for the enslaved. Through that one city passed a vast share of all the Africans ever brought to this country. Among the frightened thousands on its docks, who knows how many other scholars stood in chains. There, the scholar who had studied for 25 years was sold like a common animal. The man who bought him, Omar tells us plainly, was a cruel and a wicked master. The learned teacher was now expected to labor in the brutal heat under the lash. A man who had spent his entire life among books was simply handed over to the fields. He spoke no English, he knew no one, and his learning meant nothing at all to his owner. To the man who bought him, this scholar was only a back, a pair of hands, a price. It was a fall so total and so violent that it is almost impossible for us to grasp. Unable to bear the cruelty, Omar did the most dangerous thing an enslaved person could do. He ran, fleeing north and entirely alone, with no map, no friends, and no real plan. After a long and desperate journey on foot, he was captured again, far away in North Carolina. He was locked inside a jail cell in the town of Fayetteville for 16 long days. And there, inside that cell, is the exact moment our whole story truly began. It is a strange thing that a prison should be the place where a man is finally seen. But the walls of that cell gave Omar the first audience he had found in this whole land. With nothing else left to him in the world, Omar began to write upon the walls. He covered the cold stone with elegant Arabic, with prayers and with verses from the Quran. The people of the town crowded in to look, astonished and unable to read a single word. Who was this man, they wondered, who could write a language none of them had ever seen? Word of the strange and deeply learned prisoner spread quickly through the whole region. People rode in from miles around simply to look at the African who could write. In a world that insisted he was less than human, his pen quietly argued otherwise. He was soon bought by a powerful local man named James Owen, whose brother became the governor. The Owen family was fascinated by Omar, and they treated him far better than his first master. They gave him much lighter work, and they gave him something that he treasured even more. They gave him paper and ink, and the quiet freedom to keep writing in his own hand. For the rest of his long life, Omar lived inside that family as a kind of famous curiosity. White visitors came from far away to gawk at the African who prayed and wrote in a mysterious script. They called him Uncle Moreau, and they proudly paraded him as a gentle and pious old man. They wanted a tame and grateful symbol, a sign that bondage could be soft and kind. They did not seem to notice that the symbol kept writing in a language they could not read. But behind that careful performance, Omar was quietly keeping a record of his very own. In the year 1831, when he was already an old man, he wrote the story of his life. He wrote it, of course, in Arabic, the sacred language of his lost and far distant faith. That short manuscript is one of the most extraordinary documents in all of American history. It is the only known life story of an American slave ever written down in Arabic. Think of how many millions were enslaved and how few of their own voices ever reached us. And of those few voices, only this single one speaks to us in the language of its faith. And that one single fact gives it a power that almost no other slave narrative can hold. The famous narratives of slavery were nearly all written in English, the language of the masters. They were often edited, shaped, and carefully approved by white owners and white publishers. But Omar wrote in a language that not one of his enslavers could read or control. For once, a captive could write down the truth without a single censor looking over his shoulder. Whatever Omar truly wished to say, he was free to hide it in plain sight on the page. And what he chose to write at the very beginning is the beating heart of the whole mystery. By the time he wrote his life story, Omar had been baptized as a Christian. The Owen family were proud of his conversion, and Omar would speak of praying the Our Father. To his masters, he looked like living proof that slavery could somehow save an African soul. And some of his writings really do contain Christian prayers, written out in his careful Arabic hand. He was, after all, owned by a Christian family that very much wanted him saved. To refuse them openly would have been both dangerous and, for a captive, almost unthinkable. So, on the surface, the story looks simple: a Muslim scholar who became a devout Christian. But the deeper that scholars look into his actual writing, the less simple that story becomes. Because Omar did not open his own autobiography with a Christian prayer at all. He opened it instead with a chapter of the Quran, the one that is called the Sovereignty. It is a passage that declares that all things and all people belong to God alone. One scholar pointed out that this very chapter seems to argue against the premise of slavery itself. If every soul already belongs to God, then no man can ever truly own another. Think for a quiet moment about what it means to begin a slave's life story that way. He is gently saying that he belongs to God, and to no man at all on this earth. It is, hidden inside Scripture, a calm and total denial of his master's right to own him. Throughout his other surviving papers, Omar kept returning to the words of his first faith. He wrote out the opening of the Quran, and he wrote the name of God in the old way. He sent blessings upon the Prophet Muhammad in his margins, decades after his supposed conversion. These were not the habits of a man who had simply forgotten where he came from. They were the reflexes of a heart still shaped, in its quietest moments, by Islam. In one place, he warmly praised his Christian masters, and in another, he ached for his Muslim home. So, what did Omar ibn Said truly believe in the deep silence of his own heart? Was his conversion a sincere change of faith, made freely after long years of reflection? Was it instead forced upon him by a power he simply had no strength left to resist? Or did he do what frightened believers have always done, and hide his real faith inside? The honest answer is that we cannot know, and we must be careful not to pretend that we can. We cannot climb inside a man's soul across 2 centuries and tell him what he believed. But we can still read what he chose to write when he believed he was writing freely. And again, his pen returned to the faith of his childhood and his distant home. An abolitionist of the time gathered Omar's writings, hoping to show the world African genius. Even he sensed that there was more in those pages than the simple conversion story claimed. Here I want to slow right down, because this is the part of the story that moves me most. Picture an old man, enslaved for decades, far from everyone and everything he had ever loved. He has lost his country, his family, his freedom, and the open practice of his faith. And almost all he has left is a language that his captors can neither read nor take from him. So he pours himself out onto the page, writing for God, and perhaps quietly writing for us. Whatever name he prayed in at the very end, no one could reach in and steal his mind. In those careful Arabic letters, the scholar that slavery tried to erase was still fully alive. They could own his labor and his days, but they could not read the inside of his mind. And so, in the end, the most important room in his life was one they could never enter. That, to me, is a kind of victory that all the chains in the world could never quite undo. Now we have to turn and face the hardest single part of this entire history. For all of their faith and all of their learning, the Islam of these captives did not survive. It was not allowed to survive. The whole machinery of slavery was built to grind it away. Families were deliberately broken apart and scattered so that fathers could not teach their sons. Arabic was discouraged or outright forbidden, and the enslaved were pushed hard toward the church. A people who cannot read cannot easily keep a religion built upon a written book. Cutting them off from the pen was, in itself, a quiet way of cutting them off from God. Children born into slavery were rarely given any chance to learn the faith of their grandparents. Within only 2 or 3 generations, the open practice of Islam had almost entirely faded away. The prayers grew silent, the fasts were forgotten, and the old names were slowly changed. It is one of the quietest and most complete erasures in the whole of American history. An entire religious world was carried across an ocean and then deliberately starved of air. It is tempting to ask why these believers did not simply pass their faith down whole. But you cannot teach a son to pray when the law can sell that son away tomorrow. And yet, exactly like in every story that I tell you, the erasure was never quite total. Faint traces of that lost world managed to survive in the most unexpected of places. On the sea islands off Georgia, in the rich culture of the Gullah people, echoes remained. There were names and words and songs and customs that still quietly carried a Muslim memory. There were old people who recalled grandparents bowing toward the east and praying at dawn. Folklorists in the last century gathered these fading memories before they vanished forever. An old woman might still remember strange words, a prayer mat, a refusal of certain foods. And above all, there were the manuscripts, the fragile pages that outlived the hands that wrote them. Bilali's small, handwritten book of law survived inside a university library in the state of Georgia. And Omar's own life story survived as well, though its long journey was strange and uncertain. His manuscript passed quietly from owner to owner, and then it vanished for almost 50 years. It surfaced again only recently, and not long ago it came at last to the Library of Congress. There, the words of an enslaved African scholar are now carefully preserved as a national treasure. It is a quiet justice that his Arabic now rests in the library of the nation that enslaved him. The voice they tried to silence is now studied, translated, and honored at the highest level. As for Omar ibn Said himself, he never once tasted the freedom he must surely have dreamed of. He died in the 1860s, still enslaved, as the great war over slavery raged around him. He passed away just before the country was finally forced to confront the sin that had bound him. He was buried in American soil, far from the two rivers of his West African home. But the words that he wrote did not die along with him, and that one fact changes everything. Through those words, we know that he existed, that he prayed, and that he refused to be erased. We know a Muslim scholar of deep learning lived and suffered and wrote in the early United States. And through him, we can glimpse the tens of thousands of others who left behind no record at all. For every Omar whose words survived, there were countless others whose prayers simply went unrecorded. They prayed, they suffered, and they died, and history kept almost nothing of their names. So what do we finally carry away from this story of Islam in the earliest America? We carry away the simple, stubborn truth that Islam is not a stranger to this land. It prayed here before the Constitution was written, in fields that are now quiet suburbs. Its first American believers are buried, unmarked, under towns that have forgotten their names. It did not arrive last week, and it did not arrive last century, stepping off a passenger plane. It was here, at the very beginning, woven into the founding, carried inside the holds of ships. Muslims helped to build this country with their own hands, even as it denied them their God. They cleared its fields and raised its wealth, and they asked for nothing but to keep their faith. That faith was taken from them by force, and only fragments of it were ever returned. That is a heavier and a far more honest history than the comfortable one we are usually told. And it was almost completely erased, which is exactly why it matters so much that we remember. A handful of pages in a forgotten language refuse to let that truth disappear completely. So the next time someone tells you that Islam does not belong in America, remember Omar. Remember the scholar in the jail cell, calmly writing the words of God upon the wall. He was here first, and he wrote it all down, so that we would never be able to forget. His Arabic outlived his masters, his chains, and even the country that held him in bondage. In the end, the scholar had the last word, exactly as a scholar always hopes to. I am Brother Idris, and the archive remains open.